And welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This week, Tisa. Our subject this week, anxiety. We're going to get a little open, a little vulnerable this week. We're going to learn a little bit more about me than you maybe have ever expected, and learn a little bit about some of the anxieties that I deal with. Particular one. The reason we're going to focus on anxiety this week, this happens to be, by the way, episode number 75, just parenthetically, but specifically why I focus on anxiety. I have avoided this subject for 75 weeks, but it comes out of the story of the people of Israel in the desert and the golden calf. And understanding perhaps one way to think about what happens in that story, not to excuse it, but to explain it and understand it and to apply it to our everyday lives and situations. So here goes. The anxiety that I deal with is not excessive, it's not expansive, it's not debilitating in the most dangerous and scary senses of anxiety, but I have quite a strong anxiety around heavy rain. It sounds ridiculous. I admit it. It sounds ridiculous. But when it rains really, really hard, thunder, lightning, hail, all that stuff, I stress out. I get that tingly feeling. I sweat. I struggle to sleep. I walk around the house. It's discomforting. It's upsetting, it's frustrating, it's annoying to some degree, it's embarrassing. But it is something that I go through on a regular basis when there's heavy rain. I'm even feeling it right now as I'm just talking about it with you here and sharing this with you. So being very open about this. Again, I admit it's not some sort of real severe anxiousness and anxiety that I know people that I know really deal with on a regular basis. It's not all-out panic that I know other people also deal with, and panic disorders and panic attacks. That hasn't happened. But it is something that I am aware of, and it's something that as I said, I deal with, and something that I know happens. There are other things that I don't like. There are other things that bother me. There are other things that stress me out, like everybody else. But it's not that it goes to that extent, but it's one of those things that I'm aware of about me. And so when it is the case that I know heavy rain is coming, and even living where I live, where it rains a lot less than the place I used to live, New York, I get that feeling. I start to think about the idea that the water is going to come through the walls, the window's going to break, there's going to be flooding, we're going to have to deal with water in the house, wet walls, wet ceilings. What do we do if a skylight cracks and the water comes pouring through in the middle of the night? All of that. And again, admit, it sounds, to some people it may sound ridiculous, but it sounds sort of like nothing. And admittedly, again, in the context or in the spectrum of things that people are anxious about or panic about or stress about, this isn't the biggest one. But it's one of mine. And so as this has happened, this has been going on for years. And as it has sort of developed, I certainly know the root of it. And so one of the things that we're going to talk a little bit about today in Coaching with the Bible is sort of understanding the anxiety that helps sort of deal with it. So let's sort of dive in first to the people of Israel in the desert in that moment. Last year we talked about the idea of crisis leadership. We focused in on how Moses handled the situation post the event of the golden calf. Here I want to focus in the moments just before it happens. Literally focus on one verse. Chapter 32, the book of Exodus, verse number 1. The verse tells us that the people saw that Moses was late in returning from the mountain. Recap, they had this revelation at Mount Sinai. God shared the 10 Commandments with the people. Moses went into the cloud, went up onto the mountain to learn with God, to study with God, to bring down the tablets. We know that. It took time. And now, as chapter 32 begins, it appears that Moses is late on his return. And so the people gather around Aaron, Moses' brother, the number 2, effectively going to be the high priest. But in this moment, he's been tapped, let's say to some degree, as the leader. And they ask him to do something for them. And they want him to make for them some sort of a god. Now, if it's another god or if it's another leader, we'll leave that open to discussion and conversation, not the focus of the moment. The focus is the first part about what's going on here. The Bible uses an interesting word. In Hebrew, the word is boshesh. That word, the root of that word, is used only a few times throughout the entire Old Testament. And it's typically translated to mean late, tardy. And so it is here. But Rabbi Yaakov Mecklenburg, in his work, the K'taveh Kabbalah, which deals very much inside the specific words that the text uses, notes that the verse could have simply just said, a more typical language of being late in the Hebrew would be ichur or la'acher, that word about being late. That's the regular term that's biblically used for being late. That's used in the modern language of Hebrew for being late. So it uses a very specific term. And Rabbi Mecklenburg explains that they're not the same thing. That the verb, excuse me, let me slow down here. The word that is used in the Bible here means an unexpected lateness. The person is late, not out of their own choosing, but out of an inability to be able to control and manage the situation. Whereas the other version of late is an intentional, purposeful being late. I wanted to stay longer at the party. I wanted to study longer at the library. I was late. Here, I had no idea how long this was going to take. I had thought maybe that I would leave earlier, but I unintentionally ended up being held up, staying late, against my will to some degree. And so what the Bible says is that Moses is late, not out of his own volition, but out of something that's out of his control. The people see this, Rabbi Mecklenburg explains. The word is that they see that he is late, and so it's from their perspective, one, that he's late, maybe he's not late, or that he's not coming back, and two, it includes then their feelings, their experience, what's going on with them in that moment. So they see it, because the verse could have simply said, and Moses was late in returning. It says, and they saw that Moses was late. So the seeing is part of the explanation of the text. It's very important. Just note, I'm already 9 minutes in. It's going to take a little longer today. A little bit more on the Bible side in the explanation. So they see that Moses is late, and they what? What's supposed to happen at that moment? Are we more likely to expect what happened, or the alternative, which would have been that nothing happens? And so we have to always provide some context for the people, and this goes into understanding the anxiety, because my sense has always been that there's always more going on here in this moment. And when you look at some of the other commentaries on that verse, you see some of it. A number of the commentaries have this idea, one, that perhaps Moses never tells them exactly how long he's going to be away. And so after it's a sort of a normal, quote unquote, time being away from them, it starts to set in. What starts to set in? the stress. The stress that leads to the anxiety that potentially leads to the panic that ultimately leads to an incredibly rash and dangerous and horrific situation, a tragedy with the golden calf. And if you look at some of the commentaries, in fact, they write this, that it's not that 30 plus days in they start to worry. Literally moments after Moses leaves the camp and heads into the cloud, after a short period of time, it starts to creep in. The sense in the chest, the pressure, the stress, heavy breathing, sweating. The mind starts to race. We begin to think all kinds of possibilities have happened here. The sense that we can't do this on our own. The sense that we didn't deserve it perhaps in the first place. The sense that it's all Moses, it's not us. All that is built into that stress and that anxiety that is happening for the people at that moment. Is that the more typical thing that we should expect in that moment? Or should we just simply assume that nothing's going to happen and the verse doesn't show up and the entire story of the golden calf disappears because the people totally go with it? They just sort of lean into the situation. Yeah, Moses is late. What's the big deal? Totally cool. He likes to hang with God anyway. He's going to be up there for a while. He'll be back. So you have a certain group of people who believe that, who think that, who've always sensed that in the nation. And then you have everybody else. And then the group that ultimately leads to the idea of building a golden calf and ultimately does that, and we know the rest of the story. But for me, in understanding the idea that the people are anxious, the people are in some sort of, to some degree, post-traumatic kind of a situation, to the idea that even beyond that, after the highest of highs with the revelation, now it's days and weeks later, and Moses is not there, and the tablets are not with them. They don't have the tabernacle yet. It hasn't been built, so they have nothing. You can imagine where the mind wanders. You can imagine having been generation and generation of slave just a couple of months before, and just a little while before also seeing your masters die at the sea. You can imagine how that plays on the average person's mind, even a person who experienced a revelation. Because a lot of the people wonder and think and ask the question, they just had a revelation, like God just showed himself to them. How is this even possible? Take any person that you know who suffers from some sort of anxiety or has panic attacks or has had a panic attack. There is the untriggered panic attack that has no reason perhaps that it's coming and it happens. It can happen in an instant. It can happen in a moment. It can happen for no reason whatsoever that we can see. Or someone who's anxious, who suffers from some degree of anxiety. They could be at a party in a great mood, in a great space, but suddenly that's possible that it starts to build, or it's been building for a while and the stress is there, and suddenly even in those great moments, can't take it anymore. The anxiety takes over. And so that's possible for an individual, and I would contend, and I'm positive that this is the case out there in the literature, that can happen for a community as well. And maybe that's the case here. And so anxiety is real, and anxiety exists, and anxiety is in the Bible. And anxiety happens right in these moments. Moses is a human being. He goes up on the mountain, he doesn't take any food. He's been incredibly powerful. He's done amazing things. He's been around the people for an extended period of time, even if he's gone away for a day or two here and there, but he's been around them for more than a year. He's done all these miraculous things. One could imagine, even if you were a believer, that Moses being gone for so long means the worst. And so people have these anxiety attacks. And they suffer from it. And it can go from simply being the occasional situation that comes up to something more severe, into some sort of a disorder. The data says that nearly 1/3 of all adults in the United States will suffer or grapple with some sort of out of control anxiety moment in their lives. And we know that it comes up and it creeps up from some other locations. It's built off of experience, it's built off sometimes trauma, it's built off some other perhaps more dangerous situations in a person's life where the anxiety comes in and then it shows back up. In my case, that was part of the important part for me to understand it a little bit, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more in terms of the managing of it. We can appreciate that what happens at the end is panic for the people of Israel. What happened at the beginning was a sense of stress that led to the anxiety, that led to the panic, that led to the calf. So for me, more than a decade ago, multiple occasions, our house in New York suffered damage from water. Hurricanes, flooding, whatever it was. And so whenever that sort of situation arises, not light like a drizzle, arises, that's where that comes in. I know it. I know where it comes in. Now, the likelihood that it's going to happen here, where I live now, almost zero. Has it happened? It happened once. And that's why it's still a thing in my own mind. And so I deal with it. I deal with it in odd ways. Sometimes I try to go to sleep before the rain hits so that I don't hear it. And sometimes I sort of breathe through it. And sometimes I watch a comedy to laugh through it. And other times I pace the house, listening to the drops, listening to the rain, and I don't sleep. Because I'm a human being and a normal human being. And to some degree I deal with this anxiety when it comes, and I work on it. Again, as I said, and I don't want to demean or diminish anyone else's different kinds of anxieties or stresses or whatever brings it for them. Because there are many of them. But I can understand how that comes about. And so it's important to first, I think, in reading through what's going on, is really to appreciate and understand perhaps where it comes from. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a therapist, but understanding the root of it, the heart of it, helps to deal with it now. That's one. Two, one of the ways of really appreciating how to manage in the situations as they exist is sort of what I like to do also in those moments, is staying in what's called staying in my time zone. A lot of the anxiety is very much about fear about what could be the case in the future, what might happen coming up, which fear is a whole other conversation which is worthy of discussing. It's not necessarily true. It's most likely not true. But if you stay in the moment where you are now, moment to moment to moment where you are now, and I'm safe and it's fine and it's okay and I'm okay now, that helps. That really does help. Beyond that, I also like to, I admit, I'll check the doors and I'll check the drains and I'll check the skylights and I'll check the windows to make sure that water isn't coming in or seeping in. But I do some other things. I do some really good breathing in those moments. I try to, again, label it, know that this is that, and so I'm okay with it. I try to get to the sense in the space where I am comfortable knowing that I'm safe. I said that I watch sometimes comedy to sort of get my mind off it. Reading doesn't exactly do it. Admittedly, surfing social media in those moments actually does, because my mind starts to wander and I forget sometimes. It gets so wrapped in something else that's actually, for me, a good way of dealing with it. Again, it's not perfect, but it is very good. There's one that I read about today which I thought was super interesting. And I think it's very much about where getting your mind to a different space. It's helping to trick your mind. It's called Follow the 3-3-3 rule. The 3-3-3 rule comes in as follows. Look around you and name 3 things you see. Then name 3 sounds that you hear. Finally, move 3 parts of your body. This trick brings you back to the moment. So before, where we're trying to stay in our time zone, sometimes that's not enough because that's purely in the mind. But here, if you're able to say something or look at something or name something, then you're able to really focus on something else, and it gets you back to where you need to be. And so I think these are really important. These are really important with respect to what's going on in an anxious moment. The people of Israel in that moment, I think, unfortunately, acted the way they did, and we suffer to some degree, spiritually, religiously, for the mistake that they made, for operating on a certain level and for thinking a certain way when, again, the expectation appears to be that they should have handled that differently. This doesn't make them blameless. It doesn't lay blame at anybody else's feet, but it is sort of a way of understanding what's going on here. And then at the same time that we sort of understand what it is, the root of it, the heart of it, and we sort of step into it, we can begin to face it a little bit better. When we get to know the anxiety, let's become friends with the anxiety, right? To understand what's actually happening there, and we stay in the moment with it, and we breathe through it, and we're kind to ourselves in those moments, that we are not, as one article said, we are not our anxiety. We are not weak. We are not inferior. This is something that's going on. It's anxiety. It's a condition that's going on in my mind. It's affecting my body. If we can do some of those things, then we're able to really get through them to the other side. We can work on them. Again, seeking legitimate mental health professionals to deal with the deeper levels of anxiety and potentially panic, really important. If it's a situation where ultimately requires some sort of medication, ultimately, absolutely. Absolutely. If it's some sort of a therapy, right, some sort of cognitive behavioral therapy where a person is sort of working into it and sort of dealing with it and is touching at it, nipping at it also, that's where the mental health professionals come in. Here in Coaching with the Bible, what we're trying to do is to sort of, again, appreciate all these things that exist in life, appreciate that they happen to really all of us, being honest about them, and trying our best to live our best selves and best lives by living in these moments and learning how to be stronger, better in these moments so that ultimately our life is more balanced, our life is more enjoyable, and that we're able to sort of see it from a different place entirely, and we're able to manage it, and then ultimately, perhaps, we're also able to help some other people. That is Coaching with the Bible for this week. Episode number 75, the concept of anxiety as it appears, it's my understanding to some degree, in the story of the people of Israel and the golden calf, in the moments leading up to the golden calf, and how it manifests itself in my life personally. I was very open with you today about this very odd sort of anxiety and how I try to deal with it and how I try to sort of walk through it. I hope it's helpful. I look forward to seeing you in episode 76 next week.